Good evening, and welcome to Creating Effective Leadership Through Better Governance. This is the sixth webinar in the Strengthening Farmers Market series. I'd like to take this time first to acknowledge our funders for the project, Van City and the Enviro Fund. None of this would be possible without them, and the support that they've given us over the years has definitely aided organizations in creating more resilient organizations that will allow them to continue being successful farmers markets and go beyond success and actually over exceed. That's the word I'm looking for. That's the word I'm looking for sure. Creating some positive change. A little bit of housekeeping here. During the webinar, we're going to have a couple of polls. When we put those polls up, what will happen is I'll open up the poll. Then I'll ask you to answer the poll. Then I'll read the answers back to David, who's our presenter today. And then we will carry on from there. When the polls go up, you'll lose the main screen for a while, and all you'll see is the poll. Don't worry about it. That's all right. We will also be having a couple of times where we either do a answer the question verbally, or we answer the question just by writing it into the question box, and then I will forward those questions on to David myself. It just keeps it mixed up a little bit so it doesn't get boring when everybody's just putting up your hands. If you cannot speak, don't worry about that because everybody except for myself and David is muted right now, and I'll unmute people when they're going to ask a question, and then we take it off. Otherwise, we just end up with 22 people running around trying to say things at the same time, and it makes for a very poor quality broadcast. We're going to give you some opportunities, as I said, to ask some verbal questions during the webinar, but we're also probably going to have 10 or 15 minutes afterwards just for some follow-up questions. So we're very, very fortunate to have David with us. He's presented a couple of full workshops for us in governance over the last 2 years, and they were all well attended, and they've all been very, very successful in helping organizations move forward in their organizational development. So just a few words about David. David Lee is a principal with the Vancouver-based consultancy Propeller Social Enterprise Advisors. He's worked with the boards and executive directors of nonprofit organizations and social enterprises for nearly 10 years, facilitating the development of governance, strategic plans, and business plans to increase both their social and community impact and their financial sustainability. So David is actually living the dream that we're all pursuing. So good way to go for you, David. And at this point, I'm actually going to change the presentation over to Dave, and we are going to have him carry on with the webinar. So David, take it away, my friend. Here comes the presentation.
Chris, thanks very much. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us this evening. It's great to be in front of you, so to speak, in a virtual way, and hopefully we can answer many of your questions through the presentation, but as well through the Q&A at the end, and we'll intersperse answering your questions through the presentation as well. So as Chris mentioned, this is the sixth of the webinar series, Creating Effective Leadership Through Better Governance. And I've just thrown up a picture of myself so you could get a sense of what I look like. I am not wearing a similar scarf to Chris, but I'm really excited about the news from this morning as well, from the gold medal performances, but also, you know, we've been doing really well throughout the Olympics, gold or not. So for this evening, we settled on two primary objectives that we hope we can get you through to. Number one is that we're looking to convey and share so that everyone gets to an understanding of the importance of governance and how it applies to your farmers markets. And I've had the opportunity to present to a good number of the farmers markets, particularly in the Lower Mainland area. And I think what the webinar allows us to do is extend our reach across the province. So, you know, I'm really interested to hear how some of the markets in other parts of the province view governance, and some of the questions and some of the lessons learned you might be able to share. And the second objective is around starting to develop an initial action plan And this action plan will consist of assessing where your farmers market currently is around governance and considering what some of the priorities will be for implementing whatever the changes you think are required to improve, or in some cases even just start the foundation of establishing governance in your markets. So let's move on to our first poll question, and just to give us a sense of who's out there and where your farmers markets are at, Chris, if we could launch the first poll to get a feel for how long the various markets have been running for people attending the webinar this evening.
All right, so we'll get everybody to click on their answers. And oh, look at that, 84% have voted already.
Great.
Okay, so the poll is closed. And we're going to share the results. So, David, can you see those results?
I cannot. So
okay,
I'm wondering
so
if
we will have 16% have been in operation for 3 to 5 years, and 84% for more than 5 years.
Oh, fantastic. So everyone has been in operation for at least 3 years or more. And we have a good number that have been around for a long time. And you know, in the description that you provided around the webinar, this is not only for newer markets, this is also for markets that have been in place for a while. And let me just get back to the presentation here, to the next slide. And this is something that David Connell, who I believe presented at the outset of the webinar series, put together, which talks about the board of farmers markets, and indeed for any organization, will shift where it focuses based on time and perhaps the maturity of the organization. So given where a lot of you are at, you're certainly beyond creation. You're well into the working and managing phase, I imagine. And one of the key transition points in a market's life is having a market manager, someone who's actually hired to play that dedicated role as opposed to a volunteer play that role, or one of the board members or founding members play that role. Having your first staff person, i.e. the market manager being hired, definitely marks a transition from a working board, moving more into the managing, and then towards governing. And governing is where the board can spend more of its time focused on strengthening the structure and the foundation of the organization so that the right policies are in place, supporting processes and procedures, as well as really spending the time thinking about where do we want to be, not just for next season, but into the next 2 to 5 years. So thinking about longer term strategy. So I find this is a great diagram to just think about where you might be currently as a market and where you might want to be if you're a director, to think about where the board will want to spend its time. If you're a market manager or an executive director, where you might want to have support from your board and in what way. So before we get into looking at governance itself, I wanted to frame this up so that we could step back from governance. Governance can sometimes seem like a bit of a, potentially a boring topic, and I'm going to do everything that we can this evening so that this is not a boring webinar. In fact, what we're going to do is show how governance is so critical to making your farmers market truly successful, or continue to be successful and grow and do new things. And so one of the questions I have, and you can either type these in and we can refer to them as we go forward, or you can save them for the Q&A, is what are your most significant opportunities and challenges? And in some of the conversations we've had with farmers markets, when Chris and I have run these governance workshops together, are things like, oops, let me get back to next slide. You know, we have a really exciting opportunity to run a pocket market at a new location, or we're thinking of expanding our current farmers market operation to a new site. That's really exciting. And then we're going to talk about how governance is an important thing to have in place to support this kind of opportunity. And here's a really common one is, all the work for the market falls on us, the board members. And if you have now that's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, because there are many people who put in a lot of hours and work, such as your market manager, your volunteers, and the vendors who show up, week after week or every 2 weeks, depending on how often you run your market. So that's just an example of some of the opportunities and challenges that you might think about. And if you have those in mind, let's move on to the actual content of the webinar, because we want to be able to relate what governance means and how it supports you in pursuing those exciting opportunities or addressing some of the challenges that you see. So basically, we've broken up the webinar into 4 parts. First of all, we're going to just go over the basic concepts of governance. Then we'll follow that up with getting into roles and responsibilities. And thirdly, we'll get into how are decisions made. And decision making is such a core component or element of governance. So we'll spend a little bit of time of how we can break that down within your markets and make sure that it's understood. There's a discussion around the different kinds of roles people play in making decisions. And fourthly, we'll close things out by starting to help you formulate your initial action plan, which was that second objective for the webinar. So let's start with section 1, governance and basic concepts. Basic definition of governance looks something like this. Governance defines who makes decisions and how decisions are made for your organization. An alternative definition that we've used in our workshops is something that comes from the Institute on Governance, so a pretty official definition. And it goes like this. Governance determines who has power, who makes decisions, how other players make their voice heard, and how account is rendered. And so it adds a few elements there, and I think the last 2 points take into consideration how do we engage all the other stakeholders that are involved in making our market successful. And that includes vendors, that includes funders, maybe local businesses that support and sponsor aspects of your market. That includes your customers, the people who come to the market. And then the second point, or the last set of words, how account is rendered, is also a really important part of governance, in that governance talks about the responsibility that you have to your stakeholders and how you provide information back to those stakeholders to confirm that, yes, indeed, you are delivering to what you've committed to. So why do we need governance? Well, there are a few reasons, and I'll just outline a few overall reasons. Number one, it's to endorse the strategic and policy framework for the organization. So, as a market and as an organization, you will have spent some time looking at what is our strategy, and I'm sure that many, if not all of you, have a strategic plan in some form, and you have some high-level policies which you've used as a key reference point for your farmers markets. Number two is to ensure the financial viability of the organization. So that's a really key role of a board of directors for any nonprofit, as well as for farmers markets, to ensure that there's a view on what is the responsible use of the money that is in hand for the organization, as well as looking at where can we pursue sources of funding or sources of revenue to ensure the ongoing viability of the market. And thirdly, it's to ensure compliance with all legislative, statutory, contractual duties and obligations. So there's really 2 key elements to governance. They are performance. So how well is your market performing in terms of achieving its objectives of bringing local food and connecting people to their local growers and vendors? That's performance. and compliance. How are we ensuring that we're meeting all of our commitments, whether they're contractual or complying with all legislative or all of the things that are out there around food safety that we need to comply with, so regulations, etc. By the way, if at any point you have questions, please feel free to type them in, and we can address them as we go. So what governs your market? What are the elements that govern your market? Well, we talked about the fact that there's strategy, the strategy for your market. And that's going to be driven off of your market's mission and vision, which will provide the overall guidance to the development of your strategic plan. And your strategic plan may then get translated into perhaps your annual plan, whether you call that a business plan or simply, this is our annual plan and this is what we use to set our targets for the coming year. And that's really associated with performance. So let's say you have an intent to engage more youth or more school children to your market. Well, you might put that in your annual plan, and with your annual plan, you'll use that, you'll identify some targets as to how you get there. So that those sets of documents are some of the things that govern your market around performance. Then we get into some of the things around compliance, and there are some items at the highest level that are external laws and regulations. So there's the Society Act of BC. There are government regulations. There are industry regulations related to if you're selling food, as one example. City bylaws. And then beneath external, there's strategic. So this is slightly overlapping with what we see above under performance, your strategic plan, but there are some things that you've also embedded in particular documents around your market's constitution and bylaws and overall policies. And then there will be things at an operational level which you may have encoded into documents where you say, these are the market rules. These are the procedures around how the market runs on market day. These are the procedures around how we actually accept applications for vendors and how we select vendors, what the criteria are. So all of those elements together are what govern your market. Just an example of what one of these could look like, and this is a real example taken straight from the BC Association of Farmers Markets, is saying, well, let's define what a farmer's market is. And you may have adopted this directly as a criteria for how you select your vendors. So in this case, it's saying market comprised exclusively of vendors who make, bake, grow, or raise the products they sell. And I won't read the whole thing, but of BC origin. So you might have taken those exact same criteria to determine who your vendors can be at your market. And this is the rest of the definition from the BCAFM around what defines a farmer's market. So this is an example of something you can draw upon and embed or encode within your own policy to govern or guide how your market runs. So let's move on to the second section, which is around roles and responsibilities. And we're going to focus primarily on the board of directors. And we'll look at some of the specific roles within the board. Now, the primary role of a board is to provide governance. And what we see, that first slide we saw with David Connell's showing across time how a board might direct its time from creation to managing, to growing, to managing, to governance. Well, fundamentally, the expectation is the board of directors is there to govern. And I just want to put a poll question out there to get a sense of thinking about the board meetings you have. How much time does your board spend on the governance and strategy topics versus operational topics? So Chris, if we could queue up that second poll question.
The poll is launched. We launch all our polls with a siren.
That's just to show people that we're doing this real time. It's not in a studio pre-recorded.
What do you mean it's not? That's what I'm doing. What are you talking about?
Except for you.
Okay, I got 95% of you. A couple of you haven't voted. Get on it.
So, and I realize, it's not necessarily an easy question to answer because some topics might feel like, oh, well, is it strategy or operations? It kind of depends. And of course, I don't know of any board that kind of has a timekeeper that tracks, okay, we just spent 20 minutes talking about this specific thing. So anyways.
Okay. Well, we'll close the poll there, and the results that we have in, mostly operations at 50%, about 50-50, 44%, and mostly governance and strategy 6%.
Okay. Well, so interesting results, and that's not uncommon, even for organizations that are mature. And thinking back to where most of you are in terms of number of years, 5 or more, it would seem that there's still a significant amount of time, board time, being spent on operations. And we'll get into some of the tactics that could be used by markets. And I'm very curious to, I'm not going to spoil the next poll question, but I am very curious about how, actually I'm going to stop there because I will give away the question otherwise. So let me get back to the presentation. Now, the board, remembering that governance has 2 primary objectives, performance and compliance, will have a set of a set of responsibilities and expectations. And you'll see on the bullet points here, there's developed strategy and policy, there's hiring the market manager and reviewing his or her performance, recruiting new board members and ensuring that there's that sustainment of people at that board level to continue to provide that governing view of the organization. This 4th bullet is a really key one as well. It's promoting and advocating on behalf of the market as one voice. And one of the challenges we see in boards is you often bring together really passionate people, and also people who have different perspectives. As much as people are connected to the market for some fundamental reasons, there will still be some quite distinct points of view. And ultimately, as much as you want your board to be able to go through and have people express their diverse views, you want to come to a point where you have an agreement and commitment to express one voice externally. And we don't get into this topic in the webinar, but it's a part of the day workshop where we talk about, well, how do we actually run effective board meetings? And the final bullet, we talk about monitoring financials. So that's a part of both ensuring financial sustainability, but it's also compliance, ensuring that there's capturing the financials and reporting back to the government as required, CRA, etc. Now, the role of the board can be captured in a document that many refer to as a board charter. And I wonder, the different styles of board charters that are out there. And perhaps we'll leave that for the Q&A for people to share with us what they have in place that documents what the responsibilities and expectations of their board are, and whether it really articulates an expectation around spending more time on strategy and policy and governance versus operations. So that's the first step is, well, first of all, have you clearly defined the role of your board? and have you documented it? And we'll get a bit more into, have you introduced board members as they come on to the board to what those expectations are? So this is a bit of the onboarding process. Within a board, there's going to be some of the standard roles, that specific roles beyond having directors at large. So you'll have the president or chair of the board, and they're responsible for leading the board of directors and almost in all cases chairing the board meetings. You have a vice chair who provides support to, it says president, but a president/chair in their leadership role. And then you have a secretary who has a responsibility for ensuring that all of the documentation that's required from a compliance perspective, but also from a performance perspective, where you want to make sure that you're building on discussions and decisions that have been made previously, as opposed to cycling through, let's say, the same topic over several meetings. And finally, you have the treasurer as having a specific role around meeting those financial requirements and also providing the board with the information they need to make key decisions throughout the year. So one of the things that can make it challenging for where boards and board members spend their time is the fact that board members can actually play multiple roles for a market. They obviously are a director or a board member, in which case their primary responsibility in that role is to look and apply, implement governance for the market and look at things at the policy and strategic level. However, a lot of the times board members also are committee members, and their responsibility as a committee member is going to depend on what the scope and terms of reference for that committee are. We'll talk a bit about what that relationship between a committee and the board are, but this is where things can become blurred and perhaps confusing, where certain discussions that happen at a board meeting perhaps could be done in different forums. And the other hat that a board member could wear, and most often does wear at the markets, is as a volunteer or even as a vendor. So you have a person who could be playing multiple roles, and this is where it can be really important to specify what hat a person is wearing when they're having a particular discussion. What it also means is having clarity around what the relationship between the board member and staff and volunteers might be, because depending on what hat they're wearing, if they're a volunteer at the market on market day, well, they could actually be reporting to another volunteer or reporting to the market manager on that day for that role, which is very different from their role as a director, which as a director or board member, they can be conveying or developing and assuring that they're placing expectations on the market manager. So it's almost like that relationship has flipped, but it's because the person is wearing different hats. So that's something that we wanted to emphasize in the webinar. So this is where I want to talk about how there's a possibility of shifting the board to having more of a conversation at that strategic and governance level by the use of committees. So what is the role of a committee? Well, committees are a way for the board to delegate work. So if the board is finding that there's a particular topic or issue or challenge that needs a lot more discussion and a lot more research and work, well, a committee can be struck to look at that. And as per the previous slide, one or more of the board members could actually be members of the committee. Committees are also a way to engage staff and volunteers. So if there's a particular issue where you're looking for staff and volunteer input, you can draw upon them and directly involve them in a committee. The key, though, is the relationship between a committee and the board. So committees review, recommend, and report to the board. However, they are not there to approve decisions. And I'll put a small caveat to that, unless the board, in its development of the terms of reference for that committee, has decided to give that committee the authority to approve particular decisions. And similar to the board charter, we would propose that you would develop a committee charter or terms of reference that makes it really clear about what the scope and authority of that committee is. Now, you'll notice a bit of a theme by the fact that we have these these proposed documents throughout the presentation. Documentation of expectations of roles and how decisions are made is a really critical component to governance. And oftentimes if a board has been together for a long time, the need for documentation isn't apparent because everyone is very familiar with how decisions are made, very familiar with how to interact with others. The key for sustaining those processes and understanding is if you start introducing new people to the process, documentation is critical. So Chris, let's turn to our next poll question. And so I'm curious how many committees the various folks have with their markets. Hello, Chris.
Yep, the poll is launched.
Okay, great.
All right, 100% are in. We're going to close the poll now and get the results. So 11% have no committees, 56% have 1 to 3, 22% have 4 to 5, and 11% have 6 or more.
Okay, so the vast majority of you do have committees that you use, and of course committees can come in many different flavors. There are standing committees and there are committees that are struck based on need. Now, this is just a sampling of some of the committees that we would find as being typical across the farmers market. So not necessarily in a particular order, but a nomination and governance committee. So this is looking at how do we reach out and get new board members as we need them? How do we ensure that we develop governance policies or strengthen the governance that we have in our organization? And my hope is that based on this webinar, if you don't have a governance committee in place, that you would give some serious consideration as to the benefit of having a governance committee. Because all of these things that we're talking about now, having a governance committee to drive them further is something that can be really effective. There's finance committee, HR committee, and vendor committees. Now, I'm going to put a question out there, and if you want to just type in your responses, and we can refer to them as we go. I'm interested in what other key committees that you have on your markets, for your markets.
And when you
Chris,
type in, sorry, David, but when you type in your answer, if you could just put the market that you're representing beside your question as well. So type in the question and the market you're from. Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. So I don't know if we have any immediate responses.
Not yet.
Okay. Well, please feel free to share.
There we go.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so Donna from Mission City, marketing and fundraising.
That's a great one. So, both of those are so key points to that key role of driving sustainability of a market.
Yeah, and they're starting to
Um,
roll in now. So we've got special offense, policy, vendor approval committees, membership and marketing.
okay. So the membership one is also really interesting because it's talking about engaging people beyond simply being customers of the market, but really showing their commitment. And I can imagine that with your membership committee, you're coming up with new ideas about how to deepen that level of engagement with people who come to your markets. Um, the mention of a policy committee is, uh, I would say, a form of a governance committee. So some of these committees can take on different names. So there was vendor selection committee, I think I heard. You know, that could be very similar to another market's what they would simply call vendor committee. So it's great to hear that people have found the committee approach as a good way to get the work delegated from the board, but also to get others involved. And the one last thing I'll say about committees is it's a great breeding ground for potential future board members. So it provides that opportunity for people to get involved with the market and get a sense of contributing to the market and having them familiar with the market prior to standing up for candidacy for your board can give you better comfort around who's coming onto your board.
David, could we take
Yes.
a second and just maybe ask just to clarify something here? That question brings up another question. How many of the markets actually have committees that use members that are not board members? And if you have committees that use board members or use members that are not board members, just put your hand up in the chat room there, and we can just get a rough idea of how many would have committees that use members that are not board members. Because it's an interesting thought that
Chris, that's a great question.
so far we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, just 7. Sorry, I lost count. Oh, 8! Yay!
So
Somebody's
that
somebody's helping me. It's good.
just over a third then.
Yeah, that's pretty fantastic. Thanks, folks.
And it makes me think of, that first challenge that we put up there where board members are feeling like they have a lot on their plate. Um, and if committees are truly a way to engage others, and I want to use the word offload, but I don't mean it in the sense of the board members saying we don't want the responsibility, but it's really truly sharing the work of making the market better. Then the more that there are these members that aren't board members involved, the better. And the other thing is it allows for people with specific expertise that might not be available or have the ability to be on a board to be used really effectively as a committee member. Okay, thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah, no problem.
So the third part of this webinar is how decisions are made. So we talked about the board role and we talked about the opportunity to use committees. We're going to look at the decision-making process at a really high level. And within a market, there are a lot of different stakeholders that you will engage. There's obviously board directors, there's the market managers, staff, volunteers, vendors, sponsors and funders, customers, and other people or other entities. And if someone wants to, why don't we ask the question, type in if you have another thing to add to this. Just type in your response, and Chris, if we get something through, then we'll share it with everyone on the call.
Sure. So the question is, type in if you use some stakeholders outside of the ones identified in the slide, then just type in who that might be and we'll bring them up. All right.
That's right.
Local government.
That's a really good one. And obviously, the
We know
local
that one, don't
government,
we, Shireen?
I think from multiple standpoints, local government from a compliance standpoint, because often there are bylaws that would influence, what compliance requirements are out there, but
Yeah.
also as a funder, a supporter. Um,
We also had
so
Downtown Business Improvement Association as well, which is an interesting one that comes in.
that's another great one, and I think it moves into some of the really important and unique relationships that have developed over time with farmers markets. Whereas historically, farmers markets would have been seen as an alternative to, let's say, business in quotes. More often, there are some really great partnerships that can be developed, especially with the really local businesses that are within the direct vicinity of a market location. So,
Definitely.
Chris, I'm wondering, not to put you on the spot, but I know you wear many hats yourself, and so you would have both a counselor or local municipal government perspective as well as a market manager perspective and directors. Would you have any perhaps insights based on your experience of having those different roles around, what kind of influence that has or what kind of considerations around involving them in decisions?
Well, anytime you get an opportunity to involve a stakeholder, whether they're effectively engaged presently or you want them to be engaged, it's going to be a benefit to your market. Um, in our recent strategic planning sessions, we engaged not only our local government, we had the member from the municipality who was involved in festival events and animations with us, but also we brought in our landlord, so the property manager, and we've worked very hard to reach out to them and ensure that they're part of our decision making process. They're informed of the directions that we want to go with our strategic planning, and then on a basis outside of that, there are often things that are happening within the area, and I know Squamish is probably definitely looking at this one, and we are as well, where there's going to be some redevelopment of the area where your market's being held potentially. So you want to ensure that you're at the table as a stakeholder to those groups as well. So it's a
Yes.
symbiotic relationship. You have to give as much as you're taking from these, and participating with their process makes you an even more valued partner.
That's a great point, especially for uh, in terms of reaching out to the community and understanding what's happening in the community that could dramatically change the environment that you operate your market in. And so, whilst the frame for this is around how do you make decisions for your market, I think what you've triggered here is what decisions are being made out there that you as a market would want some representation and input into.
Absolutely, because one of
So,
the issues, David, is that when you're looking for long-term viability of your market, your location and your environment are critical. And oftentimes farmers markets finds themselves in a position where they're at the behest of whatever organization is giving them some space for free. So they have to make sure that
yes.
they're aware of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And, often when we think about how farmers markets reach out and have a voice in the community, it is about the advocacy around local food and things of that nature. And the issue you've raised is one of the future of the actual market and being a voice and being a part of the community to ensure that there's the sustainability of the market itself in a real operating way. So I'd like to introduce a very basic framework for how we begin to break down that decision-making process and understand what the role of all these various stakeholders could be for any given decision. And maybe if we can have people raise their hand, so to speak, if they've seen this before as I go through it. So it's something called RACI, which stands for R being for responsible, A for approve, C for consult, I for inform. Chris, are there folks that have come across this before?
And we have one hand up. Oh, two.
Okay.
Two.
There we go.
Sometimes it takes a while to find that button. 2 or 3 for sure.
That's good, and this is something that's out there in a lot of different forums, but it's basically a way to say, let's be clear on, first of all, who's responsible for making a decision or taking the action that will result in the decision, which could be the same person or a different person than who actually approves what the decision is. And then we get into consulting and informing. So consult would be engaging people and getting their input into the decision. Doesn't necessarily mean that what they say is what you do. And part of having clarity around decision making and how decisions are made is to let people understand what their role is so that there's not expectations that are different. So for example, if you say up front to people, we will be consulting with you, i.e. we'll be getting your input. However, the people who will finally approve the decision is our board. That lets people understand that their role, that they will not be the ones making the decision. So, and I feel it's really important to let people understand how their input is going to be received and used into the decision. And the last for RACI is the I, inform, which is people not being involved in a decision until it's been made, and then you let them know what the decision was, and perhaps you also let them know what the process was for making the decision. So there might be a tendency to say, well, we should consult with everybody. And what I want to introduce here, at this point, we'll talk about some of the tools. These are all downloadable from the BC AFM site. There's something called the Governance Definition Tool, which is a very straightforward spreadsheet which allows you to document the different decisions you might make as a market and the role that different people might play through a decision. So let's take the first one there. It's mission, determining what the mission and overall goals for your market are going to be. Well, in most cases, it's the board that's going to approve and actually do the work, i.e. that the board is going to be responsible for developing the mission and identifying the goals for the market. However, that is going to be with active consultation with the market manager, with the vendors. And this is just an example, so we're not saying this is the way it should be. In this case, we're saying, well, the volunteers, they're not going to be directly involved in the decision around what the mission is and overall goals, but we're definitely going to let them know what these are, because the way they carry out their duties as volunteers needs to be completely in alignment with the mission, and they need to understand how they contribute to meeting the overall goals of the market. Some other decisions that you might look at are around a decision like extending your market hours. Well, that could lay out the set of responsibilities, the roles very differently. It could be that the vendors, through the vendor committee, are the ones that actually are responsible for making the decision. Again, you might say, well, ultimately the board is going to approve that decision. Or you could say, well, no, it's the market manager who's going to approve that decision. What we want to show here are not the answers to how decisions get made, but rather a structure and a tool for thinking through how would we propose that decisions get made for our market. And the answer is going to be different for each organization. So key processes for making decisions. Well, this is either processes or perhaps forums where decisions can be made. You have your board meetings, executive committee meetings, vendor meetings, your AGM. And again, you have some documents which support or confirm and make sure that there's a reference to how these decisions get made. So I'm going to turn to the fourth and final section of the webinar, leading into our Q&A. And this is about developing your action plan. Now, good governance, what we've done is broken it down into 5 core elements. And this is obviously not going to be the be-all and end-all list, but I think it's a great starting point. And we've used this with a number of markets to look at things like starting with mission, vision, and strategy. Having your mission, vision, and strategy established is really important because it provides the overall guidance and framework for governance within your organization. Defined roles and responsibilities, and we talked about having something like a board charter for your board to be really clear on what the responsibilities and expectations of your board are. That's also a core element for good governance. And it also means defining the roles of your market manager, of key volunteer roles, having those all in place. Director selection and onboarding, and I might extend that to be director as well as market manager or key staff and volunteer position selection and onboarding. That's also an element of good governance. Informed decision-making processes, which means looking at the most important decisions that you undertake as a farmer's market and making sure that there's a good understanding of the roles that people play in those decisions. Who's responsible, who's approving, who's being consulted, who's being informed. And then assessing performance. So having processes in place which assesses performance of your market overall. So this ties directly to some of the, you know how we had the mission and you had a strategic plan and then an annual plan? Well, it means looking back on your annual plan and saying, did we achieve the targets that we set out for ourselves each year? Do we have a process where we actually go back, take a look, and going back to, if we can remember back about 45 minutes ago to the second definition of governance, how account is rendered? Well, assessing performance is a step in saying, let's actually take account as to how we performed this past year in relation to what we set as targets for ourselves, so that we can look at this, communicate it out to our stakeholders, and learn from it and get better. Assessing performance can also be applied to the individual level. So you can assess the board as a whole, you can assess board members, you can assess the market manager's performance. So this bundles all of those assessing performance processes together. And to support looking at these, there is a self-assessment tool also on the BCAFM website that you can complete with your board and staff. And what I would ask you to do right now is thinking about these 5 elements. Just get maybe a quick gut check on where you think you currently are with each of those elements. So you'll see in this partially completed table under current state, that's an assessment of, do you have something that's clear and established in place? Or is it something that is in place, it exists, but you definitely need to do some work on it? So in this example, defined roles and responsibilities, maybe you do have a board charter, but it's something you developed 3 years ago, and perhaps you need to update it. Or you've struck a number of committees, and you've developed some, 1-paragraph descriptions about what the committees are. Now they've matured, and you really need to revisit and do some work on creating a committee terms of reference. Or maybe it's not in place at all. A common thing that isn't in place for a lot of organizations are things like having a really strong onboarding process for directors or new volunteers. Assessing performance, having that real disciplined, every year we look at how have we performed in relation to our targets. So that's that first column, current state, where are we at? And in the second column, thinking about where are our priorities. Now, some of these I think will always obviously be high. Mission, vision, and strategy, I would say, should always be a high priority. Sometimes and this is a judgment call, and this is why we would encourage you to do this tool, send it out to your board and staff so that you get a collection of views across your market. Now, once you've done that, you might say, okay, now where do we spend our time if we have a governance committee or if we have board members who really want to develop the governance part of our organization? Well, you'd say, well, where do we have gaps, so the current state, where we don't have something that's clear and established? And where do we have things that are of higher priority? So in this example, we might say, well, we really need to focus on getting better definition of roles and responsibilities. We need to do something about getting a better onboarding process, like documentation package for our board members.
David?
Yes.
I have a question here. What do you mean by onboarding?
Oh, okay, sure. So onboarding is simply providing an orientation to a new board member and basically bringing them on board. So rather than throwing someone into the deep end and saying, okay, great, you're now a board member. Now, first board meeting's next week, and you're going to be expected to make some critical decisions or contribute to some critical discussion. Oftentimes if you have a board charter, that's something you start with. If you have some background material about both the history and where the market is at today and strategic plan, all of those documents together, and having someone take the time spending with the new board member, and maybe it's the market manager or the board chair or a long-time board member, spending that time with the newer board member. So thanks for that question. If there are any terms that we're using that aren't clear, please pass them on. So establishing your action plan. Based on identifying areas where you can do some more work and they are high priority, this is what you would use to identify your priorities. And you might, at this moment, if you have a pen and paper handy, write down 2 or 3 areas for governance that stand out of those 5 elements that you think really stand out as priority for what you would want to work on with your market within the next year. So based on that, then some of the next steps we would propose is, next steps are, go to the BCAFM website. There are these sets of tools and templates available, and they've been used by a good number of the markets. I think we've gotten some really good feedback. Of course, there's always room for improvement, so if you do use these tools, then please feed them back to Chris and the BCAFM, and there's opportunity for continuous improvement here. And we would ask you the following questions. What actions will you need to take within the next 4 weeks? Who will you engage and why? And we'll actually, if you want to respond to that by typing your answer to those questions in, or as a part of the Q&A, really welcome your ideas on that. One of the things that we end the day-long workshop with is a commitment. And it's not as if we lock the door and say, no one's leaving until you make this commitment. But we do ask people to make a commitment around when they would take the priorities they've identified around governance and have this presentation to their board. So that's something that you could consider within the next 4 weeks if you have a board meeting. Are there certain topics that you've drawn from this evening's webinar that you would add to the agenda and make sure become a topic that might influence what your policy committee will focus on within the next 12 months? Or a vendor committee. It depends on where you see your needs and priorities. And so that ends the me speaking part of the webinar. Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you as well as to anyone who has questions at this point.
Okay, great. So we'll use the, thanks so much for that, David. You know, that's, I got to give you credit. That's an amazing job of taking what is usually a full workshop, which takes about 4 or 5 hours, and bringing it into something that's concise and actually provides some good value for folks who are taking it into webinar form. This webinar will be available again on the BCFM website. And David mentioned that a couple of the documents that were from the workshop are available on our site. They're currently redoing that page again, so they should be back up in a couple of days. I just checked in with them to see what was going on there. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, type them on in. I have one from Randall, and her question is, can a committee have access to the membership list in order to canvass for new directors?
And maybe to clarify, is this the nomination committee that the nomination committee that would be responsible for? Okay. I think that's a decision of the board. So the board would need to look at ensuring that there's compliance with any policy around privacy of membership information. And that's something that the board would need to assess. Each market would need to determine what's appropriate based on what they've promised for people signing up as members around how they would use the members' information. So I unfortunately for that one I can't give a black and white answer, but I think it definitely first port of call is with the board to make a decision around, is it appropriate to share that information with the nomination committee?
Okay, and the next one we have is from Carolyn from Squamish. In general, what percentage of board members tend to be vendors as well?
Well, that is going to vary significantly as well. You know, I would certainly say that every market that I've worked with has had at least one person who's a vendor. Now, the challenge is always in terms of increasing, let's say, the proportion or number of vendors on the board is their time. And indeed, that's a challenge for everyone, in fact. That getting people who have both a particular skill set. One thing I would say about skill set is, you know, it's the ability to work well with others and work through that process of being able to hear out diverse points of view, but then being able to come through to committing to that one voice as a board member that you ultimately need to get to. Sorry, that's a bit of a side note, so I'm getting away from Carolyn's question a little bit. I don't think there's a set answer. Now, I think any given market could set a target for what percentage or how many vendors you think are important to have on your board. I mean, certainly you could commit to saying we will have at minimum one vendor on our board. However, you might find different forms to getting vendor input. So through a vendor committee, for example.
We've got a really great question here, and I know the answer, but I'm going to give it to you, David. This one's from Barbara.
No, this is a test.
Yeah. Can a board member who is a vendor put forward a change in policy that would benefit them and other vendors in their category?
Very interesting. A very good question. Now, as with any decision, not just a vendor-related decision, it is an expectation that board members will identify conflict of interest, and therefore, if there is a conflict of interest, would need to exclude them from the voting on a particular decision. So what's common is they can certainly have input and participation in the discussion, but when it comes to the voting, if they have a conflict of interest, i.e., they could directly benefit from the decision, then they would not be able to participate in the voting. So, Chris, would you add anything to that?
That would be my answer would have been a little shorter.
Okay.
That's just
Uh,
my experience in municipal governance is that
yeah.
even the appearance of a conflict is enough to warrant that person declaring it and not participating in a discussion, let alone putting forward a motion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. And by the way, you've got the cane, so if I'm going on a bit, just say.
It's okay.
I
We're
wish
doing
there was
well.
some. Okay.
Yeah, we've got another question. Whose role is it to create the board documentation when board wants to create a charter, etc.? Is it the board or the market manager?
Good question. I'll tell you what happens probably 90% of the time is it's usually the market manager. Um,
And is
it
that more by default?
doesn't have to be, it's almost by default. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Um, if there is a particularly enthusiastic board member who enjoys creating documentation, then I would definitely lean on them. There's nothing to say that you couldn't have a board member create the document for becoming the board charter.
I think
At that point, it almost becomes a negotiation.
and I think the response to that was from a market manager. Oh darn!
Sorry about that.
Dennis from Goldstring. Just a note. Take our board as well into the governance mode of board maturity, but every director on our board is a vendor in our market. So yeah, that's a little point there. You know,
Right.
they have to be a member of the association, though, do they not? I mean, that's the way most members, nonprofits are operating. They have to be a member of the association to be on the board of directors. That's just for the BC Societies Act.
Yeah, and that's most often as soon as if someone and there in your constitution and bylaws, you can also put in things like how long a person needs to have been a member for, so that you don't have situations where someone just shows up at the AGM, hasn't been a member at all, signs up and gets on the board. And there are different reasons why they nonprofits put in like a certain minimum time that you need to be a member.
Yeah, and that definitely does exist in them, and we've seen that happen on a couple of different boards.
Yeah. Maybe just in response to all board members being vendors and what that might imply around making decisions around vendor policy and such, because obviously if you said, well, everyone has a conflict of interest and no one can vote, then you couldn't make those decisions. I think a lot of this has to do with the transparency of and letting your key stakeholders know how decisions are made. So under the RACI model, you would still say that the board would approve these decisions related to, let's say, vendor policies. You would want to make sure that there's a really good process for consulting the broader set of vendors and make sure that they understood how their input would inform the decision. So
Yes.
the first principle above all is the transparency of how decisions are made and sharing that with your key stakeholders.
And what we have done in the past with that is the definition for the role of a board member is that they must ensure that when they make their decisions and then any discussions that they have to be in the best interest of the organization as a whole and not of themselves and as an individual vendor. Even a politician can be found in conflict at some level, but it's got to be a direct pecuniary interest in a legal means. So, as long as people sort of look at it and if they state out a trick that a number of boards use is they'll have that a statement to that effect in the boardroom, or it's on the table when they're making their decisions. So they're always looking at that, and they're always reflecting on whether it's the mission of the organization or whether it's, we pledge that we will make all of our decisions in the best interest of the organization, forgetting those interests of our own. And that's something that's just a nice reminder to have there, and it keeps people thinking about it when they're making decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great element to include in your board charter. In fact, it's in any board charter that I've seen.
Yeah.
Is just reconfirming that type of expectation of any board member.
And the penalty for conflict of interest for a board member can be very significant. I mean, obviously they can be in conflict and they can be censored on the board, but they can also be made to do silly dances through the market wearing funny clothing. So just a little bit of, so we don't get too serious here. If anybody has sorry, if anybody has any questions that they want to do verbally, you can just put your hand up and I'll activate your voice microphone as well. So go ahead, David.
Well, I was just going to say it's good to add a little spice to a topic like governance, and I made the commitment that we were going to make this a compelling webinar. I think you've helped us along that way.
Well, I try. That's good. That's great. So if we don't have any more questions coming here, I see a few people we're about just about quarter after now. David, I mean, I got to say again, well done with this. Thank you very, very much for your tenacity in putting this into a webinar form. This webinar will be available on our website after I've edited the bad jokes out of it. I'm allowed to do that. It's my job. So we'll send it out. Webinars 1, 2, 3, and 4 are now available. If you signed up for these webinars or participated in them before, then a note was sent out from the BCAFM office on it with the link to the webinars on our webpage. Please, if you haven't received that by tomorrow, send them an email to info@bcfarmermarkets.org, and we will. They'll make sure that you get it. Don't email me on this one because that's not what I'm doing. So the office. So just send that email to info@bcfarmermarkets.org, and they'll take care of that for you. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to close off the presentation now. David, again, thank you so much, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Chris, thank you, and thanks to the BCAFM. And I mean, it's exciting to have a group of people out there to share this with. So thanks to everyone for taking the time out of their evenings.
Great. All righty. Well, we're going to wrap this up then.